Okay, we'll start with the first question so far. John, you mentioned mental toughness and grit are marketing gimmicks earlier in your presentation, but the terms are ingrained in sport, even in our society. As coaches, how can we speak to our athletes?
That's a wonderful question, because the first set of presentations did mention culture, but we didn't get to the examples of how culture is formed. Culture is formed through messaging. You know, it is a narrative. The best story wins. As I was talking over to lunch with Joyce, we were talking about I took 6 people on the street here and asked what it means to be a Singaporean. There'd be some differences, but there'd be some really strong, similar themes. If we go to a third world country where the government is not as stable or a financial system isn't, there's going to be a large variation. So culture is by information. But it's seeking out all the opportunities to create the narrative. So I think you have to create the narrative. But it's okay to start with mental toughness and grit and then start to explain what it isn't. But more importantly, who are you? And really the concept that, if I had presented, I would have been over, is human resilience. It's a neurological concept of you create readiness, you create resilience, and then you create adaptation. It's all based on neurology. You've all experienced if you've ever taken antibiotics. You take an antibiotic and it creates a resiliency within the system and then it creates adaptation. So I think you can use the terminology, but you have to create a story about who we are. And I think the best organizations create that story, but it's well-packaged truth based on science. Because we live in a factless environment now. Really? If you have a high social media profile, then you're an expert. But when we move to that, now we live in fantasy. So your stories have to be based upon science and truth. But I think it's possible. We did it in New England. I've done it in many, many places. But it is understanding and creating a story.
So could you offer some practical tips then for particularly our coaches in the audience on how they could create this I guess, safe environment that you're referring to?
Sure. Safety is one of the things when we think about culture that's not often thought about. I think it's in the news right now, more in corporate environments, and some of the examples were portrayed up here today. Certainly, I was sitting there with our first speaker wondering which controversy he was going to choose. Could bring up USA Gymnastics. Certainly not a safe environment. So safety is based upon your ability to create a connection. And that's by behavior, voice, one-to-one contact, and transparency. The brain doesn't not like an unpredictable environment. Our brain likes a predictable process. It's a predicted organ. So safety should be a given. And one of the ways is not shaming athletes, not admonishing them in front of others. Management of your tone and pitch is critical. I mean, sometimes I've seen coaches and they've been really innovative and progressive and like, I'm a performer. I have to improve in my instruction. I have to improve in those high pressure situations. And they have children, and I'll say to them, would you have spoken to your children like that? And then there's a pause. So how we interact, again, because we interact non-verbally and verbally is critically important to safety. But I think those are the pieces. And then I would go into the mental toughness. How do you make that safer if that's their belief? Is to approach them and saying, no wonder you believe this. We've all kind of been fed this. But these are some things that really have to do with you getting better. And I want to connect you with the nutritionist. I've been talking about sleep, and let's make sure you understand sleep. Because if we don't sleep, at your #1 performance enhancer, you're going to become weaker and weaker neurology-wise. So I think it's yes and. Yes, this is the narrative you learned. I learned it too. It's not true. And this is what we'll do to replace that idea. It's not yes, but. Because work with what they know.
There's one question here that has quite a few likes, so let's go with that one. Please share with us how you teach elite populations to manage their emotions. So I guess, again, sort of a practical question there.
Yeah, for sure. So since the brain is an emotional brain, and it's primary there first, we are the only mammals that actually have the ability to use breath rate control to actually control the rest of the impact of see and do, see and don't do inhibition. So I'll tell a little story, which some, unfortunately, people saw me the other day. I did tell. So I live part-time in Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian is our national museums, and the Smithsonian took over our national zoo. And so what came of that became a research institute. And I caught wind they were doing research with primates, so lowland gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, chimpanzees, our closest cousins. We're actually not Homo sapiens. I think that just makes us feel better. We're primates. And they were looking at brainwave and wanted to understand, do they experience humor in the same way? Not a comedian standing over them and telling jokes, but they had to figure out, how do we induce humor? So they tickled the primates. These are some brave research assistants, let me tell you. I thought it was a funnel for the Navy SEALs, so anyone that wanted to do it, they were going to get a tryout with the SEALs. What they discovered was, if you tickle them, they eventually pass out. They do wake up not alarmed, they're still giggling. But we don't. We've all laughed so hard where we've almost wet ourselves, and we catch ourselves, we catch our breath. And it's that ability to manage breath rate that has allowed us to be able to handle high pressure situations. So it's teaching them what we call heart rate variability biofeedback breathing. It is very easy. We teach women it all the time, a form of it, natural childbirth. I've been told by women it's painful, but it works. I believe them. And so what we do know in a clinical setting for health, and also from a knock-on situation in performance, we know that it's incredible. In the military, they call it tactical breathing. We train our athletes, they'll have their heart rate up to 100 beats, and in 2 breaths, get it down 80 beats. So you're in the 100 range, you can perceive, act, and certainly move in a very different way. And yet we don't teach this to kids. How many people in the room have had performance anxiety and forgotten stuff on a test they studied for? They only taught us that in school.
Okay, so we've got tickling, we've got breathing, but there is a really good question here.
Sure.
Around, you talked about mental load, not necessarily being measured. I mean, obviously we talk about internal and external load. Yeah. So what are some ways that particularly our grassroots coaches in the audience could attempt to measure that?
So the easiest way to measure central nervous system readiness is emotion. I've been talking about it. So simply asking athletes how they feel and creating a culture in which they will be honest. We know our athletes are trained to be socially desirable. Fake good. Because we've embedded them in an environment where a coach goes, "You ready?" "Oh yeah, I'm ready." And in their head they're going, "I am so not ready." And so we have to create a trusting environment and transparency about the data. Who's got the data? How's the data being used? But also it creates an opportunity to educate them about emotions and to discuss them and how to regulate them. But emotion on a non-objective standpoint is one of the most important things to be evaluated. You can evaluate it on an objective standpoint, but for, as you said, grassroots coaches, what can we have access to that has low, it doesn't cost anything, low-hanging fruit. Yeah, emotion. Just asking that. It's actually the 3 things I would say. It'd be emotion, sleep, and hydration. Those are central nervous system predictors. You can get objective data, but you also, by having the discussion, open up other discussions. And that's why it's very positive.
There's a question here, and again, another valid question from a coaching perspective, around, a lot of our coaches, particularly at grassroots, sub-elite level, they're juggling many athletes. And they don't necessarily, I mean, I think we in our next talk might touch upon coaching systems in other nations where they have assistant coaches. But let's say with these coaches have multiple athletes and don't necessarily have any assistant coaches. How are they going to manage all the different relationships and be the performer that they might like to be and still get some semblance of performance out? What's a summary, I guess, if we could put it on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I've been learning over the number of days about the grassroots efforts here, it reminds me a bit of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. It is not, although it is elite sport, they do not have many coaches to manage a large situation. So you're under-resourced on human resources there. So it does sound familiar to me. I think one of the pieces is where we start to look for other mutual partnerships. Often in sport, we may look at as parents as we want to jettison them from the process because they may provide some noise in the system that makes it harder to focus on things. But I think when you have parents involved, you're creating a larger context of stability in your environment, stability in your messaging, stability in your connection points. I think the other piece of it is this is where leadership comes in, is teaching our young athletes how to, and this is one of the transferable skills from sport, how to take care of others, how to identify the need for support. And that's what leadership is. Leadership is a dynamic of serving others. And often we should be teaching that to our athletes as opposed to service to self. So I think some of those are, but of course I think context matters. If I heard more about the context, there might be some other opportunities in there.
And I guess on that note of support, I just encourage those of you, there are so many questions here. I've just been trying to read. I think that's fantastic, that's exciting. I was actually a bit worried as the chairing this that there may not be many questions at all. So that suggests to me that you have a lot of thoughts, you have a lot of comments, and more importantly, you're seeking answers to some questions. So please look up Dr. Sullivan around for the rest of the day and today and tomorrow. But also there's a whole sports psychology team. And for my staff in the audience, if you could put your hands up, please. Identify yourselves. These are the people, these are the experts to seek out for the rest of the today and tomorrow. So thank you very much, and thank you for your insights, Dr. Sullivan. If we could all share our appreciation.
Thank you.